If you've been keeping an eye on the rental market, you'll know something feels off. Rents hitting record highs, queues around the block for every viewing, yet more landlords selling up than ever. But here's the thing, none of this is random. Every time a rental crisis hits, whether it's in Stockholm, Dublin, or closer to home, the same chain of events plays out. Our team has been studying these markets for years, and the same story always repeats itself. So in this video, I'll reveal the red flags that show a rental crisis is brewing, how governments unintentionally make things worse, and what all of this means for the future of renting and being a landlord in the UK. A rental crisis doesn't come out of nowhere. There are signs and patterns that repeat across different countries and decades. Let's start by looking at a fictional landlord, Martin, who was living in Buenos Aires in 2020. Inflation is running wild, with prices in the shops rising week after week. Then the government steps in with a new law to protect tenants. From now on, Martin has to offer 3-year contracts. Rent rises are capped in line with wages, even though wages are falling miles behind inflation. And every contract has to be priced in pesos, a country that's collapsing against the dollar. The law is designed to give tenants stability, but it plunges landlords into chaos. When Martin sits down with his calculator, he realises that the numbers don't add up. And he isn't the only one. Landlords all across the city start pulling their properties from the long-term rental market. Some leave homes empty rather than lock themselves into loss-making contracts. Others flip them into Airbnbs, where they can charge in dollars instead of devalued pesos. The impact is brutal. Within 3 years, the supply of long-term rentals in Buenos Aires has collapsed. Airbnb listings have almost tripled. And despite the caps, real rents are up by about 140%. A law designed to make renting more affordable ended up leaving tenants with fewer homes, higher prices, and entire neighbourhoods skewed towards tourists instead of locals. Now let's look at Dan. He lives in Stockholm. And when he turns 18, he does what everyone does. He signs up for the city's rental queue. He figures he'll wait a couple of years and then he'll get his own flat. But by 23, he's still waiting. Same at 25. And by 28, nothing has changed. If Dan wants a flat in the city centre, he's told the average wait isn't just years, it's more than a decade. This all comes down to Sweden's rent control system. Since World War II, rents have been capped at well below market levels. Once someone gets one of these contracts, they don't give it up. And why would you? Who would walk away from a flat that's 70% cheaper than the going rate? So demand builds and supply never opens up. Across the country, more than 90% of municipalities say that they don't have enough homes. In Stockholm alone, the official queue for a flat averages 9 years. And when people can't get a home legally, they find other ways. Sublets at full market prices, bribes to skip the queue, even entire black markets. Wealthier households know how to play the system. People like Dan are stuck waiting in line. So yes, rents look cheap on paper, but in practice, tenants are paying in time, stress, and corruption instead of money. Finally, let's look at Anna, living in Berlin in 2015. The government brings in something called the Mietpreisbremse. I don't speak German. Or rent break. On paper, it's simple. New contracts can't be more than 10% higher than the local average. But when Anna goes looking for a flat, she quickly realises that the rules don't apply the way they're meant to. If the property is furnished, it's exempt. If the landlord does a small renovation, it's exempt. If it's a new build, also exempt. So while the headlines talk about rent controls, in practice, prices are still climbing. Studies later showed that the law only knocked rents down by about 3% once, then they kept going up. 5 years later, Berlin takes things even further with the Mietendeckel, a tougher rent cap that actually freezes or even cuts rents across older flats. And at first, it sounds like a win for tenants. But almost overnight, listings disappear. Construction slows because developers are worried that the rules will change again. Investment flees the city. And when the law is struck down in court just 15 months later, rents bounce straight back, in many cases even higher than before. For Anna, it means constant uncertainty. One set of rules one year, a completely different set the next. And at no point does the underlying problem change. There still aren't enough homes. And this sort of thing isn't just happening overseas. We can see similar issues right here in the UK. Meet Sarah. She's been renting in Manchester for the past 5 years, and every time her tenancy ends, finding a new place feels even harder than the last. Since 2015, England's population has grown by more than 2 million people. That's like adding another city the size of Birmingham. But the number of rental homes hasn't really increased at all. Even after a rebound in 2024, rental supply is still a third lower than it was before the pandemic. That's why when Sarah goes to do a viewing, there are 20 other people in the queue. In fact, the average property now gets around 21 applicants, double the pre-pandemic level. And with that much competition, rents have surged. The rate of increase peaked in double digits and is still running at around 6 to 7% a year, up 30 to 40% in just 5 years. And then there's James. He's been a landlord in Birmingham for over a decade, but in early 2025, he decides to sell his rental flat. And he's far from the only one. At the start of the year, around 16% of all homes sold were former rentals, up from just under 10% the year before. In real numbers, that means roughly 18,000 properties disappeared from the rental market in less than a year. Why? Well, for James, it was a mix of things. The removal of Section 21 no-fault evictions, looming energy efficiency upgrade requirements, new compliance burdens from the Renters' Rights Bill, and the simple fact that costs had climbed while profits had fallen. In the end, the stress just outweighed the reward. The problem is, every time a landlord like James sells up, the pool of rental homes shrinks even further. Obviously, the property still exists, but if it's bought by an owner-occupier, it'll no longer be part of the rental market. And rental stock tends to be used more densely. It's much more unusual to have spare rooms than in a home someone owns. So if new homes aren't being built fast enough, this shifting balance means every sale makes the shortage worse. Finally, let's look north to Scotland. Fiona owns a flat in Edinburgh, where in the wake of COVID, the government brought in some of the toughest rental restrictions in Europe. Rents could only go up by 3% a year. There was an 8% tax on buy-to-lets and second homes. Tenancies became indefinite, with stricter eviction rules plus new licensing and energy requirements layered on top. The aim was to protect tenants, but while rent caps applied to existing contracts, new lets were exempt, and rents there have soared. By August 2023, rents in Scotland had risen by almost 12% in a single year. Since 2020, they're up by about a third, 3 times faster than before. Even now, rental growth in Scotland is among the highest in Europe, still running at around 6 or 7%. And far from learning from this, the government is now proposing laws that will make rent controls permanent. So while the UK may not have copied Argentina's peso contracts or Sweden's lifetime rent caps, the end result is strikingly similar. When regulations pile up and landlords head for the exit, supply shrinks. And when supply shrinks, rents rise, no matter what the policy was supposed to achieve. For tenants, that means higher costs and fewer choices. For landlords, it means navigating a market that's becoming more complex and more regulated every year. That's why it's so important to structure your investments carefully and stay ahead of the changes. To help with that, we've put together our free £100 million property toolkit, with the strategies, calculators and checklists our clients rely on to stay ahead of the market. You'll find the link in the description. So does this mean that governments should just give up, keep their distance and leave the market to it? Not exactly. Because there are places that have managed to avoid rental crises. Katrin on our team has been looking into what they have in common. And as she's about to explain, the reasons might surprise you.
First, let's visit May, who lives in Singapore. Like most people in the city, she grew up in a HDB flat, public housing built and managed by the Housing Development Board. About 80% of Singaporeans live in these blocks. But this isn't low-quality housing. The flats are well designed, connected to schools, transport and healthcare. And instead of renting, people like May buy a 99-year lease, so it's closer to affordable home ownership than traditional renting. The results speak for themselves. Around 90% of Singaporeans own their own home, and housing costs typically eat up about a quarter of household income, far lower than the 40 to 50% you see in many other big cities. In Singapore, the state didn't just regulate private landlords, it became the biggest housing provider itself. Over in Vienna, Carl lives in a modern apartment block run by a housing association. The rent is affordable, around 30 to 50% lower than the private market, but the building quality is high and the neighbours include people from all income levels. This isn't unusual. About 60% of Vienna's population live in social or subsidised housing, provided either by city or non-profit associations. Entry is income tested, but once you're in, you don't have to leave if your income rises. That avoids the stigma and ghettos that social housing often creates elsewhere. Because rental income is reinvested into upkeep, new developments, the system has kept growing for decades. Vienna has managed to stabilise rents and avoid shortages while still leaving space for a healthy private rental market. Finally, meet Amy in Tokyo. She's able to rent in a modern, central apartment for far less than she'd pay in London or New York. And it's all because of Japan's planning system, which is far more flexible than any other parts of the world. In most Japanese cities, apartments can be built in a wide range of zones, even in areas marked as commercial or light industrial. That means when demand rises, the housing supply can rise too. Despite Tokyo's huge population, this city has managed to keep housing relatively affordable. Real house prices in Japan have been stable or even falling for decades, even as Tokyo has grown to one of the largest cities on Earth. So whether it's Singapore's public housing, Vienna's social housing, or Japan's flexible zoning, the lesson is the same. You don't fix rental markets by punishing landlords. You fix them by building more homes at scale over decades.
So now you know the pattern that always plays out before a rental crisis, you can see what's coming next, long before most investors do. But spotting the trend is only half the battle. The bigger question is, with rising costs and new regulations, should landlords even stay in the game? That's exactly what I tackle in this next video.